So for our last session today, session 4, Novel and Adaptive Labeling Approaches, PLR and Beyond. Please welcome back Marie Trentacosti from the Labeling Development Team at FDA. Also welcome back Ingrid Brzezinski from Eli Lilly, and from AbbVie. Sorry about that, AbbVie. And Gina, please welcome a new panelist, Gina Monteiro. She's a Global Regulatory Affairs Manager, Global Labeling Development, and from Eli Lilly. Thank you, and welcome, Anne-Marie.
Thanks very much, Eric, and good afternoon again, everybody. So this is my disclaimer. So 2006 was a banner year at FDA because we published the PLR rule, physician labeling rule, and for us labelers, that's a big deal. So in order to set the tone, in order to set the tone for the presentation, we're going to take you back to 2006 and do a 2006 trivia. It'll not only set the tone of the presentation, but also this is the last session of the afternoon. It may wake us up a little bit. So I'm going to invite everybody to participate. Those online, you can respond. We'll have a poll, and there'll be a selection of responses, A, B, C, D, or E in some cases. Please vote, and we can actually see your responses. And those in the audience, we'll ask you to raise your hand. Okay, so here we go, 2006. Oops. Yeah, okay, great. So in 2006, which baseball team won the World Series? Was it A, the St. Louis Cardinals, B, Detroit Tigers, C, Chicago White Sox, or D, the Boston Red Sox? Okay, everybody online, please vote. And I'll ask those in the audience, anybody for A, the St. Louis Cardinals? Anyone for B, the Detroit Tigers? Anyone for C, the Chicago White Sox? Anyone for D, the Boston Red Sox? Okay, so we see in the room we've got a lot of Boston Red Sox folks, and looks like online the #1 response is the Boston Red Sox. We do not have a lot of good baseball fans in the audience today. I'm sorry. I'm really disappointed. Sorry, so the correct answer, am I doing this, Jeff? Okay. So the correct answer is actually the St. Louis Cardinals, and they played that year the Detroit Tigers. The Chicago White Sox won in 2005, Boston Red Sox in 2007. So not too many baseball fans. And if I ask today who's going to win the World Series, I'm not going to ask that question because we all know it's the Astros, so I'm not even going to go there. So, okay. Next question, again, 2006. Which was the most popular movie, top grossing movie? Was it A, Star Wars Episode 3? Is it B, Harry Potter and the Goblets of Fire? C, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest? Or D, Spider-Man 3? So please vote online. Those in the room, anybody for A, Star Wars Episode 3? B, Harry Potter and the Goblets of Fire? A lot of Harry Potter fans here. C, Pirates of the Caribbean, Dead Man's Chest, a lot of them. And D, Spider-Man 3, not too many of them. Okay, and let's see, online, everybody voted for Harry Potter and the Goblets of Fire. Gosh, you guys are not doing well. Okay, the correct response is Pirates of the Caribbean. So I found this question very interesting because many of these sequels are still playing now. Pirates of the Caribbean is still playing. Star Wars, Spider-Man 3, and I heard there may be another Harry Potter, so movies haven't changed a whole lot since 2006, really. Okay, next question. You have to start doing a little bit better here. Do I have control, Jeff? Okay. In 2006, what was the price of a postage stamp? Was it A, 37 cents, B, 39 cents, C, 44 cents, or D, 49 cents? Folks online, please vote. And folks in the audience, how many for A, 37 cents? A lot of them. How many for B, 39 cents? A lot, quite a few. How many C, 44 cents? And how many D, 49 cents? Okay, so online, looks like folks voted for the 39 cents, and the answer is 39 cents. So you finally got one right. That's good. Does anybody know what the current price of a postage stamp is? And probably I didn't because of the forever stamps, right? We have, but the actual answer is 49 cents. So currently, right? But forever stamps kind of hides it from us, right? Anyway. Next question. In 2006, the most popular social network was A, Facebook, B, Twitter, C, MySpace, or D, Friendster. Okay, everybody please vote online. And those in the audience, how many for A, Facebook? How many for B, Twitter? How many for C, MySpace? Most of the folks here voted for that. How many D, Friendsters? Nobody that. Okay, and online too, looks like MySpace is the answer, and you guys are correct. It is MySpace. And what's interesting, I think we'd all agree social network certainly changed. Friendster, which I never heard of, was actually the more popular before MySpace. And the headlines in 2006 was, what is the new guy in town, which is Facebook going to actually surpass MySpace? We all know how that ended. So, because this is a labeling conference, we have to ask some labeling questions. So this is for those labeling folks who keep up with trivia. In 2006, FDA published which of the following final guidances concerning the content and format for human prescription drug labeling? Is it A, the warnings and precautions, contraindications and box warning sections of labeling? Is it D, adverse reactions section of labeling? Is it C, clinical studies section of labeling? Is it D, A, and B, or E, B, and C? Everybody please vote online. And those in the audience, how many for A, warnings, precautions, contraindications, box warning? How many for B, adverse reactions? How many for C, clinical studies? How many for D, A, and B? And how many for E, B, and C? Okay, online, everybody seemed like they voted for A and B. And the correct answer is B and C. So that one you guys got wrong again. It's not good we're not getting money or a game show host or anything. Got prizes here, no prizes. But the actually the warnings and precautions, contraindications, and box warning section of guide, the draft guidance was 2006. The final was 2011. So I tricked you. Final question. The 2006 PLR final rule, A, set minimal graphical requirements for labeling. B, revise current regulations for prescription drug labeling of older products by clarifying certain requirements. D, require that all FDA-approved patient labeling be reprinted with or accompanying the prescribing information. D, A, and C, E, all the above. Okay, everybody please vote online. How many for A, set minimal graphic requirements for labeling in the audience? How many for B, revise current regulations for prescription drugs for older products by clarifying certain requirements? C, require that all FDA-approved patient labeling be reprinted with or accompanying the prescribing information? D, A, and C, and E, all the above. Okay, great. So I think you guys got that one right. The answer is all the above. So, okay, great. So now that we're back in 2006, we got back to 2017, and I think in 2006 when PLR was published, the main goal was to revise the content of labeling so that labeling would be easier for healthcare providers to access, read, and use prescription drug information. And I would attest that that's still very current today. I think that highlights, contents, the full prescribing information, the way the labeling is still set up is still very pertinent to what we do. And I think it's accessible and very user-friendly for prescribers. However, I think the challenge we face is that sometimes we don't quite know how to label some content because either the information isn't discussed in regulations and guidances, and FDA is constantly approving and publishing new guidances, but we still can't keep up with it. Or B, I think the most common thing we're seeing now too is drug development, technology, everything's advancing. So we're left with how do we label certain things. So the presentation is going to focus on novel adaptive labeling approaches and what are some options for considering labeling information that's not discussed in guidance. And I'm going to be providing several examples, but these are examples. There may be several other options for doing this because, again, these are novel. So the first thing to think about is when you're discussing novel adaptive labeling approaches is the information pertinent to safe and effective use of drug? If it's not, it probably doesn't belong in labeling at all. But if it is, the next question to say is it best communicated in the prescribing information? And let's go back to this. You've seen this slide before, but the prescribing information is a summary of the essential scientific information needed for the safe and effective use of a drug. It's not everything we know about a drug. It's not a medical textbook. And part of our job at FDA is to put things in label. Part of our job at FDA is to take things out of labeling. And Farouk brought some great examples of PLR conversion. We take a lot of things out of labeling. But even currently approved drugs, we're constantly taking things out of labeling. We'll have a medical officer will spend 10 months on an NDA review and know that drug inside and out, and have an 80-page review. And it's hard for me to talk them into not having a 4-page warning or precaution about one risk because there's so much to say. But at the end of the day, our labeling is a communication tool, and we need to make it concise. So we need to think about is what should go in labeling, what should we summarize, and when should we consider other avenues for discussing information that's safe, appropriate for the safe and effective use. Medical product communications, publications. Eric mentioned FDA has a drug snapshots website which describes the demographics of patients who participated in the clinical trials for newly approved drugs. So there's other avenues besides prescribing information to consider. Once you decide to put in the prescribing information, how do you do that? Well, I'm going to talk about 3 main topics. One is omitting misleading and/or clothing inapplicable labeling content. One is labeling complex dosage or administration information, and this misfit labeling information. So first we're going to start with omitting misleading and/or clearly inapplicable content. So our pertinent labeling regulations is number 1, you've seen this one before, labeling must not be misleading. And the second applicable regulation is to omit clearly inapplicable sections, subsections, or specific information from labeling. And I provide this citations here for you. This is content, you're all familiar with this, and PLR anticipated that we would be omitting sections in some certain instances, specific subsections listed under PLR, by the fact that if we omit a section or subsection, the name and numbering of the other subsections remains the same. So section 10 is always overdosage, whether we have section 9 or not. And our approach at FDA has always been to meet all labeling requirements, but in cases we have omitted misleading and/or clearly inapplicable information. Farouk gave some examples of what we omitted content under PLR, when we PLR convert. We omitted, for instance, a product that's approved for use in pediatric patients, maybe neonates. We wouldn't necessarily need a geriatric use subsection. So we've done this for years. However, when PLLR was published in 2014, we had to revisit this concept. And this is not a PLLR talk, by the way. There will be one tomorrow. So save your questions specific to PLLR for that tomorrow. But I'm going to talk about in the context of omitting clearly inapplicable or misleading information. But just to get everybody on the same page, as you know, when PLLR was published in 2014, the subsections pregnancy, labor and delivery, and nursing mothers became pregnancy, lactation, and females and males reproductive potential. So PLLR provided us a new opportunity to rethink this whole issue of omitting required content. Again, this is not new. We've been doing this for years. It's in the PLR implementation guidance as well. So why did we revisit this under PLLR? Well, because this is PLLR, and if you look at PLLR, if you look at 8.1, 8.2, and 8.3, you'll see there are many more requirements than we typically think of for other sections of labeling. There are these headings and subheadings which we don't typically see with other sections of PLR labeling. So the PLLR requirements are more prescriptive and have more required content and format requirements compared with the other sections of labeling. And I showed examples of the headings and subheadings requirements, but there's also requirements for specific statements, such as the risk and benefit lactation statement, which I'll show you an example of in a minute. And there's also a requirement for noting not only available data, but in some instances the lack of available data, which again is unique, rather unique, mostly for PLLR. So using a fictitious example, my drug, I'm going to show you how these PLLR requirements could fit and how we might think about omitting what we would consider clearly inapplicable or misleading content. So let's say that my drug is indicated for the treatment of erectile dysfunction, and is an adjunct to other diagnostic tests in the diagnosis of erectile dysfunction. So obviously this product has no use for females, no intended use. However, if we were to PLLR convert my drug, this is what we would have to do. For the pregnancy subsection, to meet the PLLR requirements, we would have to have an 8.1 pregnancy subsection as a requirement. We must include a risk summary heading, irrespective of whether we have data or not. We would have to put in information or lack of information concerning the risk or potential risk of adverse developmental outcomes for humans based on both human data and animal data. And then there's a requirement for this estimated background risk of birth defects and miscarriage in the U.S. irrespective of drug use. So for a product that's approved for erectile dysfunction, one would think, if any of this is necessary or clearly inapplicable. If my drug were to meet the PLLR requirements for lactation, again, we'd have the requirement for 8.2, lactation, the risk summary heading. And then there's also a requirement to include not only the available data, but lack of data regarding the presence of the drug in human milk, effects of breastfed infant, and the effects on milk production. So this content would have to be required and considered. And then finally, there's this requirement. This is the background risk, the risk-benefit statement for lactation that's required for products. I'm going to read it for you so you can understand what it says. It's the development and health benefits of breastfeeding should be considered along with the maternal mother's clinical need for my drug, any potential adverse effects on the breastfed child from my drug or from the underlying maternal condition. So again, for a product that's indicated for use for erectile dysfunction, much of this information we would consider clearly inapplicable and even possibly misleading. So we went through this exercise with many of these PLLR examples, and I should say that most of the time the content is necessary and is placed in labeling, but we've had to face a lot of these examples. And essentially what we would do in this case with pregnancy and lactation would just be to omit the entire subsections. So next I'm going to turn my attention to labeling complex dosage form or administration information. So the dosage administration guidance, and this is brought up again in the previous presentations, provides a lot of useful information about dosing recommendation, administration, preparation, and we've been using for years flowcharts, diagrams, tables for difficult or complex dosing administration information. However, I want to bring to your attention maybe some other options for consideration. And Eric brought to your attention a clinical studies overview, but you also may want to consider a dosage and administration overview section. We typically have maybe important dosing information or important administration information, but this is a little bit different. This is more of a dosage overview subsection specifically. And this is Pegasus, and what's discussed in this dosage overview section are a lot of different topics that don't necessarily are all cohesive. So for instance, in the beginning it talks to you about administering Pegasus by subcutaneous injection once weekly in the abdomen or thigh for the treatment of, and it lists the conditions. It talks about the use for when combination use is necessary to refer to the prescribing information for the other products. It also highlights or summarizes some key aspects of dose modification. And in this subsection are included cross-references to more detailed information for the other subsections in dose administration. So this is a little bit different because this is a complex dosage administration subsection that we've kind of combined a lot of different things, but in an overview type of a use approach. The other thing I want you to consider is an instructions for use for healthcare providers. So typically, as I mentioned, the dosage administration subsection, or section of labeling, should include all the information a prescriber needs for the safe and effective use of the drug, and usually that alone is all that's necessary. We typically think of instructions for use as a form of patient labeling, and that's commonly used for products that are very complex, maybe a drug used with a device, and will have a patient instructions for use. And those patient instructions for use are used by healthcare providers, not just to train the patient, but for the healthcare provider themselves, because oftentimes these drugs must also be administered by the healthcare provider as well as the patient. However, there are instances where we have complex dosing and administration information And a patient instructions for use is not warranted because the product's not administered by the patient, but it's administered by the healthcare provider. And we can think of a specific patient instructions of use just for a healthcare provider in those instances. Again, maybe a situation where a drug is administered with a device. If you choose this option, what might be a useful approach is to, again, summarize all the key aspects of drug use, administration, and dosing in the dosage and administration section, but then include a cross-reference and a hyperlink to this healthcare provider instructions for use. And because we do have a patient instructions for use, you may want to actually entitle it healthcare provider instructions for use to differentiate it from a patient instructions for use. This is Systol. This is an antiemetic that is available in a kit. This is an example of a healthcare provider instructions for use. This is just the first page or several pages of this. And this discusses what the product is, how it's used, how to prepare it, how to administer it, very much what you would think of for a patient instructions for use, but this is for a healthcare provider. And if you think about that, again, FDA does not have any guidance on this, and we don't have any recommended formatting for this or content. So if you're considering this approach, certainly propose something to FDA, work with FDA, but this could very well be a very viable option for you. So going back to content, and again, the required sections and subsections under PLLR. We also have a option for including non-standard subsections and or headings to help us organize and present the information, or for ease of finding the information. And we've done this all the time. We've very commonly added subsections and headings to our existing subsections and headings in PLR. For instance, dosage administration. We'll commonly have a 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and each of these may be the dosage administration for a particular indication. 2.1 may be the dosage administration for indication A, 2.2 the dosage administration for indication B. We might have 2.3 as administration. So we've done this. Warnings and precautions. We never have, I've never seen, never, there's always some exceptions, but we typically have many subsections for warnings and precautions. 5.1 hepatotoxicity, 5.2 renal impairment. So we're used to this. However, I'm going to discuss some misfit topic information that you might not quite think about where this information goes and where to develop a subsection or heading for this type of information. And I'm going to be discussing immunogenicity data, juvenile animal data, other specific populations, patient experience, and patient counseling information section. So let's start with immunogenicity. So immunogenicity assessments for therapeutic proteins are studies that evaluate the immune response to these proteins and their potential to impact efficacy and safety. And most commonly, we'll find these impacts of these immunogenicity studies in warnings and precautions, which discuss the risk and what to do about the risk. But the question then becomes is, where do we put this immunogenicity data? We really don't have an immunogenicity section or subsection labeling. In the past, we've seen it all over the place. So actually, the first guidance to address this is the draft biosimilar labeling guidance. Not that this is not pertinent just to biosimilars, it's actually pertinent to all therapeutic proteins, and the guidance actually states this. But this guidance actually discusses an immunogenicity subsection specifically for adverse reactions. And we typically see this wedged between 6.1 clinical trial experience and 6.3 post-marketing experience as its own standalone subsection. And I think that at least the biosimilar guidance also provides some recommendation about this introductory paragraph, because again, I think the data, we've had this an introductory paragraph from the beginning, at the end. The type of paragraph or information in here has been very different. So I think the guidance is helpful that it gives a recommended approach. Obviously, other approaches can be considered for this introductory paragraph, which alerts the prescriber to the fact that therapeutic proteins have a potential for immunogenicity. It discusses factors that can influence antibody formation, and it also cautions against comparing antibodies either across studies or between products. And if the product is a peptide, oligonucleotide, or heparin, those words are included instead of the word therapeutic protein. Now, unfortunately, we probably would be useful maybe at some point to develop a guidance about the content beyond that, but at least I think this is the first good step of having an introductory paragraph, where the information should be placed, and at least how it should be placed. So next I'm going to discuss juvenile animal toxicology data. So non-clinical toxicology studies in juvenile animals, these are used to provide information concerning the safety profile of a drug in immature systems and the drug's potential effect on growth and development in pediatric patients. But the question's always been, where do we put this information? Does it go in pediatric use subsection? Does it go in non-clinical toxicology? Where is this information best placed? So I would recommend putting the information in the pediatric use subsection. However, I would recommend not to summarize the information in terms of clinically relevant information and only include juvenile animal data in labeling if if the data suggests an adverse signal. If the data does not suggest an adverse signal, putting that information in data, particularly for a drug that's not indicated for use in pediatric patients, could lead the reader to believe that it's safe in pediatric patients. And we certainly can't make that leap from animal data to humans to necessarily feel comfortable with that. So again, only if the information suggests an adverse signal would we recommend putting it in labeling and in the pediatric use subsection. But that information shouldn't be the first information you see. The first information, again, under the pediatric use subsection should be what's based on the regulation cited here, which is the safety effectiveness of the drug in pediatric patients have or have not been established, and the clinical data, available clinical data, efficacy, safety, whatever is pertinent to that product. And then after all that, I would suggest placing a heading juvenile animal data and summarizing the data there. So what type of information do we want to put? Again, the focus is on clinical relevance. We have reams and reams of juvenile animal data, which is paragraphs and pages, and we really have tried to cut down on that information and discuss it only in terms of clinical relevance. So you can, of course, talk about the animal doses, but what does that mean for human doses? How does that dose equivalent to human doses? What are the age of the animals studied, and how does that relate to human ages? Because a 12-week-old rat, I don't know what that means for a human, and to translate that is very useful for a prescriber. The organ systems affected. I've seen hind limb splay and labeling. I don't quite know how a human can do that, so I don't really think it's useful. Excessive grooming. I think of my teenage daughter getting ready to go out with her friends, but again, I don't think that's necessarily negative for humans in that case. So what does that mean for humans? Translate it to human terms, maybe central nervous system toxicity or something that's relevant. Discuss the duration of treatment in the animal's relation to clinical use. Again, 3 weeks for an animal may mean, 2 years for a human. So translate that. What does that mean for human use? Whether the effect has been seen, observed to be reversible, and if applicable, any developmental delays that were observed. So next I'm going to talk about other specific populations. So we have a use in specific population section, and the regulations do describe the following subsections: pregnancy, lactation, females and males' reproductive potential, pediatric use, and geriatric use, as you all know. And the regulations also give us an option to include other data about other specific subpopulations. And the example given, and the one we most commonly think about, is renal and hepatic impairment. But I want to challenge you to think about, besides the renal and hepatic impairment, the ones we commonly think of, think about other populations that you want to put in this use in specific population subsection that might be useful. So we're obviously obtaining more pharmacogenomic information, and this might be an area to include clinically relevant information concerning pharmacogenomics, summarizing data and any clinical relevance and what to do about it. So this is an example of an 8.7, CYP2C19 poor metabolizers, and discusses the fact that poor metabolizers have increased exposure compared to extensive metabolizers. Extensive syncope occurred in one subject who was a CYP2C19 poor metabolizer. It recommends increased monitoring for those who are poor metabolizers. And then it goes on to discuss that the frequency of poor metabolizers are approximately 2.5% in Caucasians and Africans and 2 to 15% in Asians. And There are cross-references here both to adverse reactions and the clinical pharmacology subsection, which would provide the genomic data. Some of these subsections could indeed form the basis of warnings and precautions if necessary, but this is the place to start, a use in specific population subsection. Here's another example of smokers. Smokers caused induction of CYP P1A2 levels, and exposure in smokers was lower than non-smokers, and therefore the efficacy of the product may be reduced in smokers. So again, outside the box kind of a thought process for a use in specific population subsection. Now this is something very unique. This is Veramox chewable, and Veramox chewable is indicated for the treatment of patients 1 year of age and older with gastrointestinal infections caused by either roundworm or whipworm. The basis of approval for this product, however, although it's approved for patients 1 year of older through adults, is based on clinical studies only in pediatric patients. So if you looked at section 14, you're just going to see pediatric exposure and safety and efficacy data. So it leads the reader to believe, well, why did you approve this in adults if we only have pediatric data? So in this case, an 8.6 adult use actually was developed, and this discusses actually sort of the basis of approval, and discusses the fact that use of Veramox chewable in adults is supported by evidence from adequate and well-controlled trials in pediatric patients 1 to 16, includes the cross-reference to that information. Safety data in adults, and includes the adverse reactions section cross-reference, and pharmacokinetic data in adults, and the clinical pharmacology cross-reference is included there. So again, another unique possibility for a use in specific population subsection. Next, I'm going to turn my attention to patient experience data. And when we think of patient experience data, we typically think of efficacy most commonly. And as you know, FDA is very interested now in obtaining patient experience data throughout drug development. And sometimes that information may be pertinent to labeling, sometimes it's not. But if it is pertinent to labeling, you have to figure out where it belongs. Efficacy data we commonly think about as patient-reported outcomes that inform a treatment benefit associated with a disease. Maybe improvement in pain for an analgesic, say, or improved activities of daily living for an Alzheimer's drug. That would be patient-reported outcomes will be commonly seen in section 14, efficacy data that support the approval of the product. Safety data is usually not typically patient-reported outcome unless we see it as commonly at this time as a prospectively evaluated safety endpoint. So let's say an ACE inhibitor causes cough. If you want to study a new ACE inhibitor, you may have a prospectively evaluated safety endpoint of cough in your trial, and that would be a patient-reported outcome. That would actually still be in section 14 of efficacy, because that is a prospectively evaluated endpoint. We think of safety data, we're talking about adverse events that eventually become adverse reactions for labeling. And those are commonly collected by clinician reports, as you know. However, we've actually started seeing and encouraging, and you may have heard of the PRO-CTCA in oncology, which is a patient-reported adverse event reporting, where we're obtaining patient reports on some of these adverse events. And so we may actually see them sometime in labeling and adverse reactions as complementing what the clinician reports are. Again, this is an evolving science, so an evolving regulatory path, but this is something that's happening. But there's also this other category of information from patient experience that may not quite fit into efficacy or safety, and where would that information go? And so you may have seen Rituxan Hycela. This is a rather newly approved product, June 2017. And for those of you unfamiliar with Rituxan Hycela, it is rituximab plus hyaluronidase. Unlike rituximab, which is given by intravenous infusion, Rituxan Hycela is given only over a few minutes subcutaneously. However, the patient must first receive at least one intravenous infusion of rituximab successfully before receiving the subcutaneous Rituxan Hycela because of the risk of infusion reactions and hypersensitivity reactions. It's easier to stop an infusion if a patient's having a severe reaction than during a subcutaneous injection. And this product is approved for the similar oncology indications of rituximab, which are the follicular cell lymphoma, diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and CLL. So as you would think, the labeling for this product discusses and shows some of the safety and efficacy data that prescribers would find useful, such as the PK comparability between the rituximab and the Rituxan Hycela, the switch between IV to sub-Q. It also includes efficacy endpoints, which you would think of for oncology, such as overall response rate and complete response rate. However, this data is a little unique. This is patient preference data. And so I don't know if you can read it, but I'm going to summarize it for you here because I think it's important because this is very novel. In that this is a 14.4 patient experience subsection, so it is separate than the efficacy data that is in the rest of the 14 clinical studies. Essentially, it talks about the fact that patients were randomized to receive either standard chemotherapy and Rituxan Hycela for cycles 2 to 4, because again, cycle 1 they had to receive intravenously, or again, standard chemotherapy and rituximab for cycles 1 to 4. And then there was a crossover, and those that were in the Rituxan Hycela arm then received cycles 5 to 8 of rituximab. Those in the rituximab arm for cycles 5 to 8 received Rituxan Hycela. And what it states here is, and I'm going to again read this because I think it is important. After cycle 8, 477 of 620 patients, which is 77%, reported preferring subcutaneous administration of Rituxan Hycela over intravenous rituximab. And the most common reason for that administration was that administration required less time in the clinic. After cycle 8, 66 of 620 patients, which is 11%, preferred rituximab intravenous administration, and the most common reason was that it felt more comfortable during administration. 48 of 620 patients, which is 7.7%, had no preference for the route of administration. 29 subjects, 620, 4.7%, received cycle 8, but did not complete the preference questionnaire. So again, this is one option. This is very new. This is an evolving area, but we may start seeing more of these patient experience subsections in section 14. Last topic is patient counseling information. And the patient counseling information guidance does mention the fact that most commonly any information, the patient counseling information, is based on the other sections of labeling. There's nothing new in patient counseling information section usually. However, there are exceptions. And the exceptions are some maybe a product causes a discoloration of urine for a serious adverse reaction, which is, an adverse reaction that's for a serious disease. And that adverse reaction of discolored urine is not discussed in section 6 because it's not considered pertinent really as a serious adverse reaction. So you might want to discuss in section 17. Maybe the use of a sharp disposal would be something you want to add to patient counseling information. We recently had an application that was a topical product. The dogs were licking this product and getting very sick. And we didn't want to put that anywhere else in labeling, so we put it in section 17 that the unintentional exposure to pets, which could be toxic to pets, that might be something to think about. So again, something that may be unique that may not be pertinent to the other sections. In rare instances, you may want to think about putting it in section 17. So in summary, I think PLR is still the backbone of what we do for communicating prescription drug information. And we'll continue to publish guidances. We have some in the works, as mentioned, indications and usage as well as others. But there's always going to be new, novel things that are coming out that we don't always have a guidance for recommendation, especially as medicine evolves. So what I would suggest is that as we continue to evolve and think about new and adaptive approaches for labeling, number one, think about a target product profile. And a target product profile discusses your labeling goals in milestone meetings for FDA. So we have an idea of what do you want to do at the end? What are your labeling goals? And that helps us to focus the discussion as well. Early and frequent input from FDA. I think this is particularly important when you're thinking of novel labeling approaches, maybe like a patient experience subsection, which I just discussed. What you may want to think about is maybe during a pre-NDA BLA meeting, that might be the time to alert FDA that you're thinking of a novel labeling approach, so that gives us time to think about it ahead of time and discuss it with appropriate stakeholders. And I think shared experiences, just like we're doing here. I think we may be more label, and I'd be interested to see what my colleagues think about more labeling conferences, talking about some of these issues that are in a pre-competitive forum about how did you handle this and how did you handle that. I think this is going to be constantly something we'll be challenged with. And I thank you very much. And now I turn it over to Gina for her comments.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, for a very informative presentation. Hi, I'm Gina Montero from Eli Lilly, and I want to just give you a quick overview of a project, a global project that we completed at Lilly that really demonstrates an adaptive approach to labeling. This was a global project. We were trying to determine if we could recommend a consistent placement of immunogenicity text in physician labeling. Immunogenicity texts or anti-drug antibodies, or I'll refer to them as ADAs throughout this short commentary. We had observed that there were some inconsistencies, and so what we did was we pulled, of course we looked at regulations and guidance, but we pulled labels. We did focus on monoclonal antibodies just because of our product portfolio, and we did a review of over 60 labels in the US. Like I said, we did look at some other global labels, and we determined that all of the immunogenicity text was in Section 6, the adverse reaction section, as Anne-Marie kind of alluded to earlier. There was cross-referencing for one label in Section 5, as there was a warning, and then there were a handful of cross-references to Section 12, the clinical pharmacology section. So with this US review and with our other reviews, we were able to determine a consistent placement for immunogenicity text in our physician labeling globally. In addition, we at Lilly, as I'm sure many of you do, test our approved labeling with our clinicians for understanding. So we have tested immunogenicity text with those clinicians in different forums, and what we've determined is that if there's a specialist, let's say an endocrinologist or a dermatologist that's used to prescribing large molecules, they're very familiar with immunogenicity text, what we're trying to convey. Also, you know, any information that we're trying to convey, whether there's a clinical impact that's known or unknown. However, as our product portfolio expands, what we've determined is that general practitioners are not as familiar with this text. And we've determined there's opportunities for education, but a potential future project is how can we, in the USPI, convey this immunogenicity text so that it is understood across clinicians. They understand if there's any impact to their patients and what to do with that information. So just want to just briefly talk about those adaptive approaches that we've taken with immunogenicity text. And I will turn it over to Ingrid.
Hi. I hope this time everyone can hear me. I heard last time some people on the phone could not, so I will try to speak up and lean forward. I'm going to talk about making information easier to understand for the prescribing physician and for the patient, because that's really what it's all about. I alluded to the example a little bit during session 3 in response to a question, but we had a product that was approved last year where the physicians had to be very careful when they were ramping up the dose for the patient. It goes from 50 to 200 milligrams over a 5-year period. And we basically thought we were covered. We had it in dosing, warnings, precautions, ADRs, ClinPharm, clinical studies. We also did some user testing. And basically the KOLs, the key opinion leaders, said, we still don't know when to hospitalize. We still don't know exactly when we should, which patients are the most critical. So we went back over everything. We said, well, based on the patient's tumor size, the blood values, how much hydration they're going to need at certain points, and any other medications that they're on. So we actually were able to create a guidance on how to ramp up and submitted that to FDA. We also had it very prominently in patient counseling and in our med guide. So it was number 1, so 5.1 and throughout. And we felt pretty good about it, and it was clear. But FDA further simplified it by making it into a table, which is both Farokh and Eric have been talking about today. And it's a beautiful table. It's something that MedInfo loves, the MSAs love. You can look at it and you can absolutely see which patients are the most critical, what to do. It's really great. It also helped us to create a quick start guide, which is for patients, and it shows them exactly how much water to drink 2 days before their next dose and how much. Then we got questions from just people at AbbVie saying, well, if there's 2 things of water, because it's 6 to 8 glasses a day, does that mean the other days I don't drink water? Yes, you still drink water. So, you know, the more you test it, really the better it is, because really your end users are the ones who have to explain it to understand it. So we considered it a success for the physicians, the patients. You know, FDA was great on it, and AbbVie was very happy. So that was sort of just keep testing, because that's really, you know, give it to your mother. You know, can she understand what the patient information means? So that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Gina and Ingrid, for those insights. And now we're going to move the panel on to the Q&A. Eric's going to be the moderator for us so that if some of the questions need clarification, we can get a restatement. And right there, right off the bat, we'll start with the question here in the room, microphone number 1.
Yes, thank you so much. Great presentation. So my question is for Anne-Marie. You're talking about to move the pharmacogenetics informations under the section 8 of the labeling. So how did you move this information under the section 8 versus the section 12 under the pharmacodynamic, so you can provide the same information for the pharmacogenomics information?
Thank you for the question. I'll summarize it. First, before we go to the question, thanks, Anne-Marie, for a fantastic talk. Gina and Ingrid, fantastic knowledge about user testing. This is something the FDA we're interested in, about how to develop labeling, and we could discuss that further. The question was about distribution of pharmacogenomic information in Section 8, using specific populations, versus Section 12, clinical pharmacology section.
Okay, so I think this is a difficult concept for a lot of folks, and I think we need to think of Section 12 as a data section. Only data goes in Section 12. We shouldn't have any clinical recommendations, dose adjustment, anything goes in Section 12. It's clearly data. So start with Section 12, whatever data you have, whether it's pharmacogenomic data, whether it's drug interaction data, hepatic impairment data, summarize that information in Section 12. And then the next step is there any clinical relevance to that? Does it need to be moved up to a clinical section? If it's a drug interaction, are there clinical implications? Yes, you summarize it. You don't repeat the data. You summarize it and move it up to Section 7 as a summary. You discuss the drug interaction, and you'll be getting a talk on this tomorrow, and the clinical implications. For pharmacogenomics, the same thing. Summarize the data in Section 12, and if there's clinical implications like I discussed with the patients who are smokers, then you actually summarize it in Section 8, because that's a specific population, right? It's a hepatic impairment, and it's a specific, unique population. You want to summarize it, just maybe what the issue is, and then, because it is a clinical section, you describe the clinical recommendations, clinical implications. So those are clinical sections. Section 8 is a clinical section. So it only goes in 8 if there's something to do about it or something you need to think about. If there's something, a lot of times in Section 12 we'll have information maybe about drug interactions, and we don't really think know what the clinical implication, or don't think there was one, and that data just stays in Section 12.
Okay. Thank you so much for the clarification. So I have another questions, but I will wait, yeah?
Yeah, that's it. You're my new favorite person. Thank you. Microphone number 2, please.
Thank you. I have a question about Section 17, thinking of novel approaches. The regulations and guidance says it should give information that patients need to use the drug safely and effectively, but most of it really is focused around safety issues. Have you seen much changes to perhaps put benefit information in there? Benefit information.
Just repeat the question for the online audience. The question is with respect to the patient counseling information section, Section 17. typically we see safety information. The question was, is there room for including efficacy information in section 17?
So I think that the reason Section 17 was crafted was because we were part of the discussions. I said that's why we know it's crafted. Is once the prescriber has discussed with the patient, this is what treatment I'm going to give you, and these are the important things you need to know to go home to take it safely and effectively. It's not, meaning that decision's already been made about this is what I'm going to give for you. And it's just a summary. And it's really not meant to replace patient labeling, because I think also, I'm always wondering as a patient myself, if I go to the prescriber, when we have, as you know, patient counseling information can have 15 warnings of precautions and all, remember you have to do this, remember you have to do that, and I'm thinking, how am I going to remember all these things, right? So that's why I think it's not to replace, it's just that discussion with the prescriber and the patient. Now I think patient labeling, there's going to be a discussion about that tomorrow, has a different role. And it could be, and I think you might want to bring this up tomorrow, as you know, PMI, patient medication informations are coming. That may be a role in the future for that. But I think from the prescribing information focus, I think that is, I don't think that's going to change. It's really mainly, these are some really important things to remember. Don't miss a dose. If you miss a dose, that's really that discussion.
Excellent. Let's go to an online question, please.
Okay, we've had several questions regarding when it would be appropriate to omit the PLLR section. So for example, in postmenopausal women, in geriatric patients, in a drug approved for use, not approved for use in women, in scenarios such as that, is it appropriate to omit subsections 8.1, 8.2, 8.3?
So I think that the PLLR exercise for us, and I hope that you feel you saw this, is that there's so many levels to PLLR of what to omit. So the highest level, of course, is to omit the entire subsection. But I wouldn't start there. I'd start with each component of the PLLR and each requirement under each specific subsection. And it may be that sometimes some of it's relevant and some of it's not relevant. So for a drug maybe that's contraindicated for use in humans, I mean for pregnancy, we may want to describe the risk. However, if the risk is observed in humans, but the animal data didn't show any risk, then you may want to think, do I want to put that animal data in? Does it suggest misleading information? Does it minimize the human data? Right, so then that's your call there to look at the data. Then there's the benefit risk statement. Do you want to put, or the risk of miscarriages in humans? Do you want to put that information in? So you may just omit certain aspects of it, but not necessarily the entire subsection. I think that's the highest level, and that's in rare instances. So I think you have to think about the product and the indication, and if there's still something applicable to pregnancy and or lactation, because women can get pregnant even though they're not supposed to on a drug, and if there's some risk there, it's still probably relevant to that drug.
Okay, we've got somebody coming up the microphone in the room right now. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much to Anne-Marie, Ingrid, and Gina for those presentations. I really appreciated the real-world examples you shared. And my question is for Ingrid. My name is Monique Richards from AstraZeneca. I was wondering about your discussions with the FDA about that guidance that you developed. At what point in the labeling discussions, negotiations, did you have that back and forth where they provided the table? Was it early at a pre-NDA or BLA meeting, or was it later?
No, so the FDA did say that they would like some more clear, concise information to the prescriber. So we had several paragraphs, and we had really narrowed it down from where it was. I mean, originally it looked sort of like the ISS, which was a bit much. And then we took the most pertinent parts and tried to do, you do this first, you do this first, get the blood, look at this, look at that. And we put it into very succinct paragraphs. And it was during label negotiations that they came up with the table.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to an online question, please.
Was the patient experience section excerpted from the Rituxan Hycela prescribing information based on a validated patient-reported outcome instrument?
So I don't have access to the data, and I don't think it's actually listed on the Drugs at FDA website, so I can't answer that question. I can just, so I really can't answer what the basis of that discussion was. We're as I think was brought before, we're the communicators. Here's the relevant data. The patient report outcome group, the COA group, are the ones who review the data in conjunction with the divisions, and then they come to us and say, how is this best communicated in labeling?
All right, and next question in the room, please.
Yes. So going back to the specific population, so for example, hepatics and renal. So if there's no PK difference, did you leave the information under the section 12, or you're still providing the same information under the section 8 for hepatic and renal?
I'll repeat the question for the online audience. And please let me know if I stated the question correctly.
Yeah.
The question was with respect to specific populations. If there are no specific recommendations for the use in a specific population compared to the general population, do you only keep the information in section 12, for example, pharmacokinetics subsection in clinical pharmacology, or is there any time that you include additional information about the specific populations in section 8, use in specific populations?
Yes. Yeah, that's correct.
So in general, I would say that the information would just remain in section 12 if there's no clinical implications or relevance. However, there are times we have pertinent negatives. So if you have, let's say, all the other products in the class have a dose adjustment for patients with hepatic impairment, and your product doesn't, you may want to say in section 8 that there's no difference in patients with hepatic impairment. That's a pertinent negative. So there are instances when you might want to discuss that in section 8.
Okay, because the reason I say that, not long time ago, we submitted an application to the agency, just approved, but there was a lot of back and forth, and working with regulatory, the question is, yes, the information should be under the section 8, but the agency said there's no PK difference when you look at the 3 groups, so the information should stay under the section 12. So I think my preference will be to have a section under the section 8 to keep the information, because it's still very important for the physician, for the prescriber, even though the data doesn't recommend any dose recommendation. Because when we lump everything under the section 12, so we have age, body weight, sex, and all those information, so it's pretty much lost under these, if we lump everything under the same paragraph for all those specific populations. So, yeah.
I can understand your point. I think then the issue then becomes section 8 becomes a reiteration of section 12. That's the problem. So, and we think of it as a clinical section because the information is still there. It's in section 12. Yeah. But if there's a reason, again, another reason I'm thinking of is a product maybe that's indicated for, like, say, renal cell carcinoma, and there's no impact on patients with renal impairment. You think patients with renal cell carcinoma may get renal impairment. That would be a pertinent negative that you'd want to put in section 8. But again, and typically, because as you know, section 12 has a lot of data. It's a data section, but how much, if you start thinking about what am I going to bring up to section 8, then it becomes just a reiteration of the section.
I also agree with Anne-Marie that if you included everything for every single human prescription drug and biological product in section 8, you would have renal impairment, hepatic impairment, smokers, patients with COPD, patients with diabetes, and you could go on and on and on. So one of the critical things, as Anne-Marie said, is if there's a difference in response or safety or recommendations in that subpopulation compared to the general population. Also consider this information is also in the pharmacokinetics in renal impairment guidance. It talks a little bit about that too. Thank you for your comment.
Thanks.
Right. Microphone number 2, please.
Yeah, my question came up as this gentleman was talking. So if you have, let's say, drug-drug interaction studies or renal impairment, hepatic impairment studies where you have data that you might want to think about putting in section 12, if there are no clinical implications of that data and there's no dose adjustment, et cetera, why would you put it in 12 at all?
Because it still provides useful information for the prescriber who wants to know, I have a patient with hepatic impairment, what happened with the study? So sometimes it's useful to put that information too. Again, it doesn't have to be all, again, it's a summary of essential information, so you pick and choose what type. And we'll have, by the way, there's a discussion tomorrow in clinical pharmacology section of labeling. So, and I think Joe Grill, who's excellent, will be able to go into more details of that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's take an online question.
You mentioned that juvenile animal data should be discussed in the pediatric use subsection. Are there instances in which the information should instead be discussed in non-clinical toxicology?
I would say no, because again, if we're making the decision that only clinically relevant information should appear based on juvenile animal data and summarized in pediatric use in subsection, there's no additional reason to cross-reference to section 13 for additional information, because there wouldn't be any, because we don't really, it's all been summarized in clinically relevant terms in a specific joint location. So I would say in general, no.
Okay, microphone number 2, I think you were up there first, and then we'll come over there. Go ahead, please.
Caroline Pratt from Berger Ingelheim. In terms of novel labeling approaches and the guidance document that Ingrid talked about, how does FDA handle that in terms of approval? Because it's not under the umbrella of a PI or med guide or instructions for use. It's really a separate document.
You're talking about instructions for use for the healthcare provider.
Right, but that's maybe something different than a pure instructions for use. Like, is that guidance document that Ingrid talked about, the table, is that really an instructions for use or a separate quick tips in its administration guidance document?
Well, the table that we had as far as the blood values, that was in the prescribing insert. The Quick Start Guide was a separate guide that was geared towards the patient. That wasn't, it was approved, but it was not part of the PI. It was more an extra, like a tips type of thing.
Right, exactly. So you got a formal approval on that.
To add to that, yeah, there are additional labeling besides the prescribing information, the traditional FDA-approved labeling, medication guides, patient package inserts, and instructions for use that the FDA approves. And one example was the healthcare provider instructions for use. That's part of labeling. It's FDA approved, and it also appears on your SPL file.
We based it on the instructions for use that you would have with the device, the IFUs, which are user tested and go through FDA.
Okay, thank you.
Microphone number 1, thank you for your patience.
Okay. Thank you, Ingrid and Gina. I think my question is directed more to both of you. So I found that user testing concept very interesting. That was the first time I knew that, that I heard about it. But I think one thing I just want to clarify. So I think for Eli Lilly, it looks as though you only test it with the clinicians, because as you know, the the PI is for all healthcare providers. So I was just trying to get a better understanding.
And we do patient testing as well with any patient labeling or IFUs. But since I was talking about the PI, then I discussed the testing that we do with the clinicians.
Okay, so you don't test it with pharmacists and nurses and all the other healthcare providers?
Healthcare providers, it depends on, what the drug is, who do we anticipate prescribing the drug, et cetera. But yes, across the board, we try to look at healthcare providers as well.
So how does the information you collect from that user testing, how does that influence the labeling, your final labeling recommendations during labeling development? I'm just trying to get, at what point do you do that testing and how does that influence?
So for some patient labeling text, we test before submission. And so that can help influence what we submit. Currently, our testing that we do, the clinicians, we do have advisory boards and we have subject matter experts, et cetera. And so we do some limited discussions ahead of time that might influence the labeling, but then we holistically look after approval. And then there's, a potential for a feedback loop to come back to labeling or other departments to discuss and influence any future labeling changes or new labels that we have coming.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, let's sneak in an online question if we could, please.
Are there some required content of labeling sections and subsections that cannot be omitted?
Well, I think that there are some that we would never probably omit. I think indications and uses, for instance, right, and dosage administration and dosage forms and strengths and contraindications, I think are some that we would probably not omit. There are some that I've never seen omitted. We've actually seen labeling without warnings or precautions, which is unusual. We've seen labeling, I think Roe brought this out, without clinical studies, and Section 17, where there are maybe a product that's used maybe in an emergency setting intravenously for like a day or two, and there's no time to run and talk to the prescriber, the patient or their family about, and there's no reason to because it has to be used. So we've omitted most sections, but I think I would say sections, the ones I mentioned, description, house supply, storage, and handling, those are the ones I've never really seen omitted.
Okay, and microphone number 1, I think you're here first, and then we'll go over to microphone number 2.
Thank you. Do you have any advice or recommendations about when you would like to see or encourage patient preference information and when you would discourage its use? And if it's going to be included in the labeling, what are the data standard requirements? Does it need to be prospectively defined in your statistical analysis plan, for example?
Right, and I think that, as you know, in the 21st Century Cures, FDA has an interest in patient experience data in general throughout all of drug development. But at the end of the day, not all of that experience may or may not be pertinent to labeling. I know FDA is going to be developing guidance about that. We don't have it right now, so I'm not sure I'll be able to answer that question, but I think we'll be developing guidance about, again, that was very novel and new, that's why I wanted to show it to you, but to reproduce that, if you're interested in that, I would suggest early discussions with FDA to let them know that's something you're interested in. Thank you.
Microphone number 2, please.
Anne-Marie, you mentioned the target product profile as a good tool and to discuss that early in development. So I wonder when you recommend it, because I had an experience where we proposed it, we had it submitted as part of our briefing package for our pre-NDA meeting. And the response we got, there wasn't a fulsome discussion about it. The response was just, it looks fine, it'll be a matter of review kind of thing. So I wonder what your recommendation would be in terms of how to engage in a real discussion with FDA about that.
Well, I think if you've ever seen our meeting packages, they're very huge, very huge.
Right.
And we focus, we read it, but we focus very much on the intent and the question. So I would suggest, yes, including it, but highlighting, obviously there's certain parts of the labeling that you really don't need discussion, but if there's some, like a patient preference or something that you're interested in, highlight it and ask a question about it. And I think that's the best way to engage FDA early.
Okay, thank you, great.
All right, very good. Let's take an online question, and then we'll come back to the room. Online.
If information doesn't fit into one of the required PLR sections, can a new section, for example, section 18, be considered?
Well, that would be a great idea, but unfortunately, it would require rulemaking. And as you know, there has to be a draft rule and a final rule, and that would take many, many years. So unfortunately, at this stage, we cannot have a section 18. We're stuck with the 17 we have, but we do have an option, as we talked about, for additional subsections and headings, and we'll use those a lot. So.
Okay, now in the room, microphones step up nice close for me.
Hi, I'm Sarah Green from X4 Pharmaceuticals. My question is for Gina and Ingrid. So Gina, you mentioned that your labeling review included US and global labeling, and Ingrid, you mentioned that this table was generated while you were having discussions with FDA. And I was wondering, are you endeavoring to use this adaptive labeling approach in your core company data sheets, or are you keeping it specific to US local labeling for now?
So when I said global approach, I didn't want to discuss the core data sheet as we were at an FDA conference, but that is exactly what our global project was, looking at placement in our core data sheet. So The answer is yes.
For our product, we had already submitted to Europe without the table. So at this point in Europe, it is without the table. The core data sheet, we actually included both, which we don't usually do. And we said to those affiliates who follow US, use this because you have many dependent countries. And for those affiliates who follow Europe, use that. The same data are included. It's exactly the same data. It's just a different format.
All right, let's take an online question, please.
Is FDA considering including patient-reported adverse events in labeling?
Well, I mentioned that, yes, there would be an opportunity for us to consider that. And I think I mentioned the PRO CTCAE. That's a patient-reported common terminology criteria for adverse event reporting. And it's an NIH tool where patients, but the problem, it's a very difficult thing to think about because you have to prospectively decide what you're going to measure because, as you know, if let's take an oncology trial, there's so many adverse events, right? So you can't measure them all from a patient's perspective. So you'd have to actually think ahead about which ones am I going to pick to measure? How am I going to measure them? Am I going to measure them because, again, we have a lot of missing data from patients. Am I going to measure them before clinic? At the same time, I measure other endpoints. There's collection of the data, and then there's a huge issue would be in interpreting the data and how that data relates to the clinician reports. Let's say a clinician reports a grade 3 stomatitis, but the patient's reporting grade 1 or something less. How do you reconcile that? What do you do with that information? And then again, how to present the data in labeling. As you know, we have a common adverse reactions table. We have an opportunity for discussing specific adverse reactions in paragraphs. So how would that patient report adverse reaction information look? Would it be a table, a complementary table? Would it just be a paragraph? So it's a very complex issue. FDA is open to it for sure, and I know companies are definitely incorporating the PRO-CTCA, at least that instrument, and I don't know too much about others, but I know that one is being incorporated into clinical trials. So that data is starting to come in. So I think we're going to be faced with this issue, but I think FDA is open to it.
Okay, we've still got about 3 minutes. If anybody wants to step up the mics in the room, let's take another online question, please.
How would you determine if a risk should be discussed and used in specific populations versus warnings and precautions?
Well, I think, first off, you have to decide, again, starting from, I think, the basis of where's the information coming from. If the information, most of this information from use in specific populations tends to come from clinical pharmacology, and some of it can come from adverse reactions as well. But if the information is pertinent to what we would classify as a specific population, meaning part of the group of patients it's approved for, but maybe a subpart of that, hepatic impairment patients, renal impairment we talked about, then, or some you would identify maybe a specific race or gender, that would be useful information in the use of specific population. So that you would start there. However, that information could then again rise to level of warning or precaution. I think a similar approach you'd think about for a drug interaction. If the information's in section 12, if it rises to level of section 7, a clinically relevant drug interaction, sometimes those drug interactions make it also to warnings and precautions because they're that clinically relevant. So I think it's not an either or approach necessarily. It's more the degree of the information, the severity of the adverse reaction, the risk mitigation strategies of trying to figure out how to place that information.
One more online question.
Can an old label non-PLR format be converted into PLLR without PLR conversion?
So that's an interesting question. We have a PLLR discussion tomorrow. So I think we'll wait I think that's more appropriate for our PLLR discussion.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to ask Eric if he's got any closing thoughts, anything he'd like to share before we
Sure.
wrap up.
I just want to thank the speakers from today, industry, FDA. I want to thank the audience. We had 4 great presentations, consistency in labeling, labeling considerations for the indications and usage section of labeling, considerations to convert labeling from old format to PLR format for older products, and novel labeling approaches. Thank you. We have an exciting agenda for tomorrow. Also 4 sessions. We have 2 sessions on the prescribing information. As Anne-Marie, we have a PLLR session, so please hold your questions for then. We have a clinical pharmacology information and labeling session, and we also have 1 patient labeling session, and finally, we also have an SPL